We're still missing a lot of people, so we'll wait a little bit longer before we get started. Those of you that got on early and on time, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and hopefully the rest will pour in at some point. You might have noticed that there's another discussion post that opened up today. You have a bit more time to do this one. I believe, Brock, you already did it. What did it say the date was? My mind's so on other things today. I apologize.
Like the 28th or the 26th, somewhere there. It's for sure Sunday. I know for sure that is.
Like, I think you have over a week to do it, but the information that you're going to need to use to answer it, we're going to be going over tonight, specifically in the second half. So after tonight, I would go ahead and probably answer it, since you'll have that information already, rather than wait. If you wait too long, you're going to forget it. Yeah, so this one is not due until November 1st, actually. So you do have a long period of time, right? Is that right? That seems extra long. But no, that's right. It says November 1st. It's due November 1st. So you have a long, long period of time to work on it, but I wouldn't procrastinate doing that because you're going to forget the information by then. And that's just me being honest with you. From what I've seen so far, the longer you guys wait to do the assignments, the worse you guys do. No offense. But the earlier you guys have been doing your assignments, the better your grades on them have been. So I'd recommend you doing that sooner rather than later, even though it has a long date.
Doing that, what, 20 slides is a lot of work, sorry to say.
Yeah, I know, because you have your individual presentation that you're supposed to be doing too. So if you wait too long to do that discussion post, you're going to be swamped. So I would go ahead and at least get that short discussion post out of the way. That should only take you about 15 minutes max to do. And that way you can devote most of your time to that individual presentation instead, which is worth more points too. So please go ahead and do that discussion post and get it out of the way, especially since we're going over the topic tonight. That being said, are there any questions about assignments so far, or about the individual presentation or anything? Because I don't really have announcements. No.
Nope.
I am drinking the most caffeinated tea possible to stay awake. Okay, Eric, Did you catch the part that there's a discussion post that you need to do?
Actually, no, I forgot. I got distracted. Sorry.
You got another one that opened up yesterday that you need to do. So make sure to get that done. Oof, I can't even get onto the right class. On another note, there is one really short, quick announcement, and it kind of has to do with what we were talking about earlier. So Midland College is a self-reporting college when it comes to COVID exposure. So if you have been exposed to someone or you have tested positive for COVID at any point, even if it was like 2 months ago, you still need to make sure you report that to Midland College, because we have to in turn report those numbers to the board and then to the city so they can keep track of everything. The form for reporting is on the Midland College homepage. There's a little box that pops up at the top in purple, or it's under the announcements section on Canvas. It says short PSA because we had to do a little snippet on our announcements page for it. So if ever at any point you do test positive, please make sure to fill out that form. Also, I get notified. So if you might possibly ever need extensions on dates, or you might have to have an incomplete for the class because you catch it, that gives me the documentation that I need to go ahead and help you out there. But if you don't report, then no one's going to know. Just like usual, I am recording this lecture. So if you need it, you can refer back to it. You might definitely want to refer back to it when it comes to your discussion post. I know that my morning classes with the first 8 weeks, when they were doing their discussion posts, I know I had like 30 views on this video. So you might want to check it out afterwards to get the answers. But on another note, tonight we are starting art history, which is my favorite thing to do, which is why I'm a little sad that I'm super, super tired today. Because usually this is the section of the lessons when I start getting really excited and pumped. So I'm going to try and be super excited and pumped, and hopefully that'll come across, because I am. So with art history, it's a little bit different when we're looking at the art history of an art piece versus before. Before, we've been looking at principles of design, mediums specifically is what we've been focusing on a lot lately. Art history solely focuses on the time period that an art piece was made and how what was going on in that point in history might have affected the creation of that art piece. So with art history, there does come a certain degree of understanding world history. I try and do a pretty good job at giving you some historical context for those of you that aren't like super into history. But if you need me to elaborate, just let me know and I can. Or if you're just interested to hear a little bit more, let me know. But we are starting off with really, really old history called BCE era. So does anyone know what BCE stands for?
Before Christ?
Kind of, Daniel. So it used to be before Christ, and that's when we referred to it as just BC and AD. But back in the early 2000s, people thought that might be a little offensive if you weren't Christian. So they changed it to BCE instead of BC, and now it stands for before current era. So instead of before Christ, they just changed it to before current era. And instead of AD, we now have CE, which means current era. So for example, we are in year 2020 of the current era, or CE. So we're 2020 CE. But we're going to be with the BCE era. And how that timeline works, give me a second. I might actually draw it this time. I don't usually draw it. I might actually put some effort in and draw a little bit. We'll see. So here we have a little timeline. This might take a second, but the last time I explained it, the other class didn't quite grasp it, so it might be worth it. So let's say over on this side with the purple, we are in 25,000 BCE. What actually happens with that time as we move along the timeline is that it will shrink. So instead of 25,000 BCE, we might have 5,000 BCE. And then eventually, you will get down to year 0. And then you can go into 2020 CE, which is where we are. So if you notice, the BCE shrinks in numbers, where on the other hand, CE goes up in numbers. So you might want to keep that in mind as we go through this section. I hate numbers, but this is the one point in time that it is actually kind of useful to pay attention to the numbers so that you can get a kind of brief understanding of the timeline that we're going to be looking at. We are starting off with BCE, and eventually by the end of this class, we'll be in 2020 CE. So we will be covering a large period of time, not all tonight, but of course by the end of the semester. Tonight, we will be getting up to, I think we end up in CE. We might end up in the CE era tonight. Been a hot minute since I've done this, so we will be covering a large amount of time tonight is what I'm saying. So to start off with, like I said, art history is different from what we have been looking at. We're going to be studying a type of history, but a different history than what normal history is. Normal history is reading books and listening to lectures. Tonight, we're going to be looking at history through objects and things, so pictures, which makes it a little bit more enjoyable for my people that don't normally like history, because you're actually getting to see the objects that these people used. We're going to be starting off with objects that would probably be considered more craft than art. Actually, no, we're not in this class. Sorry, I got it mixed up with art history. My art history class is doing the same thing. So we are not starting off with craft in this class. We're going to start off with objects that have absolutely no function, which means they are not craft, but they are actually pieces of art because they have no purpose or function other than they were fun to make or enjoyable to look at. But early artifacts from these historical people, majority of them are tools, so they would have been made for craft. If you ever take my art history course, then you will get to see some of those tools. But we are not in art history, we are in art appreciation, and I'm going to try and remember that for the rest of this class. So here's just an idea of the areas of the world that we're going to be looking at with this first half of tonight's lecture. you might notice there's something from almost every continent, which means we're going to be moving from around the globe. We're going to start off in Africa, and then we'll be moving to France, and we will be moving to India, Australia, North America, and all throughout with this first half. We're going to end up eventually ending the first half of tonight in Egypt and going over Egyptian art. But first, we're going to start off in the Bulumbus Caves in South Africa. So not only are we covering a large expanse of time, but we're also going to be moving around the globe quite a bit. So like I said, a majority of the artifacts that we do have from these ancient people groups are stone tools. In a majority of the artifacts that we're going to be looking at were made using stone cutting tools. So stone on stone was used to carve these objects, which is why we call this the Paleolithic period. Paleo means old, well, Paleolithic means old stone. Lithic is old, paleo is stone. No, the other way around. So Paleolithic, we are in the Old Stone Age. Eventually we will be getting to the Neolithic era. Of course, most archaeologists and historians alike will argue that people originated from Africa, and then of course with Pangaea they migrated to the other continents, which is why we arguably find a majority of the oldest artifacts made by humans in Africa, because that's where they were supposed to have started, depending on who you're following. But most archaeologists will argue that's where life began with humans. So just like there's a debate on evolution and where people first came from and things like that, there's also a debate on when art began. So when do you consider things to be art and not craft and not tools? When is it solely art? Most art historians will agree that it is probably around 77,000 years ago with the engraved ochre piece. Some argue there's an older bear artifact that people a lot of times will say is the oldest. It just depends on which art historian you're asking or which textbook you're looking at. But for the textbook we're using, they argue that it is the engraved ochre from 77,000 years ago. This particular stone artifact is covered in an abstract pattern. You'll notice that a lot of the old art is very abstract, and then it will move into more realistic, lifelike forms, and then it will eventually go full circle. You'll actually see that throughout this art history section, that we keep going from abstract to slightly more natural, back to abstract again, and then back to natural again. A lot of people would argue that's because history and trends tend to repeat themselves. So the reason why the engraved ochre piece is considered to be one of the oldest pieces of artwork is because it serves absolutely no practical use. So it can't have been a tool, and it couldn't have been made for any purpose or function. And of course, like it says here, with Paleolithic art, the earliest findings of artifacts are from 40,000 years ago. So we are in 75,000 BCE. That C dot there, the C period down on the bottom, that stands for around, because we cannot specifically date this artifact, and the artist was not kind enough to write the date and their name on it for us. We have to guesstimate when these artifacts were made. and most carbon dating when testing this piece gave us around 75,000 years ago. So this is our engraved ochre piece, once again from the Bolombos caves in South Africa, and it is 4 inches. Something else that was found in that same cave setting were these ostrich eggs, which also have just abstract patterning on them. They held no specific purpose. Just to remind you, we're looking at these carvings here. This would have been made using a stone tool. So because this is the Stone Age or the Stone period, we do find several stone figures, such as the Holzfels figure that we're about to look at, as well as the woman of Willendorf. She used to be called something else, and we'll talk about it in a second. But the Holzfels figure is the oldest surviving carving of a human, and it is a woman. Most historians and archaeologists argue that it would have been worn as a necklace. We aren't entirely sure the purpose of this carving, once again, because it's really, really old. But the woman of Willendorf is carved in a similar manner to the Holzfels figure. Both of them are women, both of them small, both of them have the similar body types, which you'll notice, and both of them have particular attention paid towards the reproductive systems on a woman's body. So some people argue that it might have been for fertility. Some people argue it might have been a goddess. No one's really sure because it's really old and we just don't know. There have been other female figures found, though, besides these two as well. So like it says here, it might have been for religion. No one's really sure. Here is the Holzfels figure, a front and a side view. This is from around 35,000 BCE. If you notice, particular attention was paid towards making overly exaggerated breasts and a vagina. And most people thought it would have been worn as a necklace because there's a little loop on top. It kind of looks like a turkey to me every time I see it. And here is the woman of Willendorf. Once again, particular attention paid towards anatomy. This one's from a side angle, but you can still kind of tell it. This one's a little bit more realistic looking than the other one, but it is a bit newer. The other one was 35,000 BCE. This one is 25 to 20,000 BCE, so about 10,000 years newer. Originally, her name was the Venus of Willendorf, because originally when archaeologists came across her in her little cave, they thought that the people were carving her as a way to celebrate beauty. If you're familiar with Greek or Roman mythology, you might remember that Venus is the goddess of love and beauty. So they thought she was carved because they wanted to show off beauty. Most people have refuted that by this point, and a majority of people believe that it was probably for religious purposes. And of course, a large amount of Paleolithic artworks that we do have today come in the form of cave paintings. Cave paintings in Europe very rarely show humans. I think there's only like one set of cave paintings in Lascaux. It's either Chauvet or Lascaux. I'm pretty sure it's Lascaux. That actually show a person. The rest of them strictly show animals, possibly as a celebration of animals, thinking that the animals have spiritual meanings behind them, like it says here, bring the spirits of the animals into rituals, possibly. Like I said, it's really old, so it's really hard to figure out the real purpose of these things and what they took time to make. But the most well-known caves that we have today are Chauvet caves. They are the oldest known set of cave paintings in the world. But once again, if you take that art history class, we cover a whole lot of different cave paintings and not just Chauvet. Chauvet was discovered on accident in the 90s. Actually, most caves are discovered on accident, but the Chauvet caves were discovered on accident in the 90s. So they're also one of our newer discoveries as far as cave paintings. And it is a huge complex. So the Chauvet caves were actually buried by a little rock slide. So for ages, nobody even knew they were there until the 90s when someone happened to stumble across them on a hiking expedition, and they crawled inside and they're like, hey, there's paintings in here. So yeah, and in the Chauvet caves, there is the Hall of Bulls, which is what you see a little excerpt from here. So you'll notice in the Chauvet caves, as well as a lot of other cave paintings, the animals are very realistic and natural looking, and taking into consideration, of course, that this was made in 28,000 BCE. This would have been made using natural pigments found. And you might pick up on the fact that, let me see. Maybe not in this picture. No, not in this one. I might find a different picture for you guys because there's better pictures. And they're kind of cool because you can see what animals lived in France at the time. And some of them are kind of interesting to learn about. Try and get this big enough for you guys. Because a lot of people don't think rhinos when they think of France, right? It's not a normal thing that people usually associate with France. But in Chauvet Cave, we found cave paintings of rhinoceros. So that tells us that at one point there were rhinos in France. Similarly, you can see lions in Chauvet Cave. So that tells us that there must have at one point in time been lions in France. Let me see if I can find a really good image of, I want to see this one. Particular picture that I'm looking for. So when they first discovered this cave, they let people go on tour in it. However, it very quickly started to affect the paintings. The paintings hadn't been exposed to air for a really long time, and now all of a sudden they're being exposed to air and people. So it was messing up the cave paintings. So instead, what they've done is they've made a complete life-size reproduction of the cave. So if you ever go to France, you might want to check that out. So here's the image that I was actually looking for. You might notice that this particular rhinoceros has a ton of horns on it. That was their way of showing movement. So they didn't know exactly how to make it look like something was moving. So instead, they made duplicate images of the same thing. So this here is trying to illustrate to you that the rhinoceros was moving his head, and you can see his horn moving there. That'll be important for us to remember when we get to futurism in the 1900s, because they're going to do the same exact thing. You might also notice that all of these are in profile view. For a really long time in history, we're going to be looking at profile view paintings. Any questions about Chauvet Cave? It's kind of cool, so I got a little distracted there, but that's okay. Now, in the Americas, we showed pictures of people in our paintings. This is actually an above ground painting that is located in Utah. These are called pictographs. So pictures that have been drawn on stone. These are located in Horseshoe Canyon, Utah. And these are quite a bit newer. So 7,400 BCE to 5,200 BCE. These are also extremely large. You might notice that it says 7 foot. But yeah, you can go hike the canyon and take pictures with these pictographs, which once again are supposed to represent people. European Paleolithic people, they don't show images of people. They only show images of animals in their paintings, except for one teeny tiny one, and the dude has a bird head. He doesn't even have a human head. But in the Americas, we did paint pictures of people in the Paleolithic era. So like I said, petroglyphs, not pictographs. Petroglyphs are rock art carvings, so sketching or scratching or pecking that you've done into a stone rock. So using a stone on a stone, and instead of making a small sculpture, you're leaving the stone embedded into the rock wall or whatever piece you're working on. Such as the Dampier Archipelago in Australia, which is a petroglyph complex. Because this petroglyph complex is outside, it's really hard to determine how old it is. Also, the Aboriginal people in Australia do still make petroglyphs today, which doesn't help us to determine the age, but it's still really cool that they still make images that are extremely similar to these really old petroglyphs.
Hey, Miss, can you go back for me?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
No problem. So like I said, the Aborigines still make art that's very similar to this today. If you don't know what an Aborigine is, that is a native Australian. So not a European immigrant ancestor Australian. And these particular petroglyphs in Australia are currently in danger. They are being eroded by acid rains, so conservationists are curious on how they're going to preserve them at the moment, because they're not wanting to remove them from their original location, but they also don't want them to disappear. And that's just a fun little side note. So after the Paleolithic period, we move on to the Neolithic period. So new stone. Neolithic art reflects the shift in people's living patterns. So during the Paleolithic period, people would follow their food around, and the majority were nomadic or hunter-gatherer people that would follow their food. And in the Neolithic period, we see a shift of people hunting to people growing their food. We see the agricultural revolution take place. The agricultural revolution is where most historians strongly believe that current mankind began historically. So during the agricultural revolution, people settled down primarily near rivers and water sources that had good soil nutrition, and they started to grow their own food and raise their own livestock. So instead of making spears and arrows to hunt food, people instead started making things to store food, such as clay pots. So we're going to see something happen that didn't happen during the Paleolithic era, which is people making clay pots and decorating them. That did not happen during the Paleolithic era. Most people believe that the agricultural revolution first started in modern day Iraq. However, it does take place in several different locations in the world simultaneously. By modern day Iraq, we're referring to the Fertile Crescent and the ancient Sumerian people. But around the same time, there was also the Egyptians over in the Nile. There were the Chinese over by the Yellow River. There was a small island. It's not going to come up in this class anyways, so you don't need to know, I guess. My people that hate history are probably glad I can't remember. So we do see a major shift in people since their food source has now changed to something that they can grow and manage themselves. In turn, we see a lot more art that's produced. Art during the Neolithic period does reflect that shift in living, and we see a lot of geometric abstract art. So you might have noticed when we were going through Paleolithic, we started off abstract, and then with the cave paintings, we got a little bit more realistic, and now we're back to abstract, and then it'll get more realistic again, and then we'll get more abstract again, and yeah, it'll just keep going. So a lot of Neolithic art is derived from plant and animal forms, such as the beaker that we're about to look at that has ibex on them. Ibex are kind of like a ram or a goat with a big, long, curly horn. There's also dogs on the earthenware beakers from Susa. We'll also see animal motifs on early pottery from China, such as the burial urn from Kansu province. But we aren't going to talk too much about China today, since that is an option for presentation choices. Keep in mind, you do have to choose 2 objects for your presentation from chapters 18, 19, 20. I don't remember the numbers. It might be 17, 18, 19. I think it's 18, 19, 20 then. Yeah, it is. That's just a little side note to remind you that you need to be doing that. And China's section is pretty cool in that part too. Anyone that does need help with their individual presentations, I will be sticking around on tonight to help you guys with that. Here is that earthenware beaker from Susa with the ibexes. The ibex is that goat. It is right here. So you can still tell it's a goat, but it is a very abstract interpretation of a goat. Actually, it's not super abstract, it's just a little bit. And then above the goat, you can see dogs that are running around that have been very stretched out. And then above the dogs, you can see cranes with very, very long necks. And our other example of early pottery is the burial urn from Kansu, which has a very organic, repetitive swirling pattern for a decoration. Like I said, we see a lot more pottery, and we are going to see a lot more pottery from now on because people have shifted in their needs. Prior, a majority of the artifacts found during the Paleolithic era were tools, such as arrows, knives, and things like that, used for hunting. Now we're seeing tools, just a different sense of a tool used for storage. Early Neolithic structures are mostly primitive. Later on, when we get to the major cities such as Sumeria and Egypt, these structures are not as primitive. But if you remember our little dolmen from last week, that was just the post and lintel structure, that gives you an idea of early architecture for most people in the Neolithic era. So it's mostly primitive. One of the architectural structures that comes out of the Neolithic period is Stonehenge, which we looked at last week. It uses a post and lintel construction, which at the time was very sophisticated. It is still kind of impressive today, considering the stones in Stonehenge weigh several tons, and a good chunk of them don't actually come from that area, so they had to be carried for a good 30 miles to get there. There is a lot of debate on the main purpose and function of Stonehenge. A lot of people think that it is a solar or lunar temple, that it might possibly be a calendar, that it might possibly be a form of rituals honoring the dead. There's tons of theories based around what exactly the purpose of Stonehenge is. There are two kinds of stones used in Stonehenge. There's an inner circle of stones and an outer circle of stones, referred to as blue or white stones. The white stones didn't come from too far away. They only had to carry those a few miles, but they're a few tons per stone, so that's still pretty heavy. The blue stones, on the other hand, came from quite a ways away and had to be imported, and once again, those are several tons. So most people are more concerned with how did they get all of those stones there, and why did they put them in the middle of a field. On another note, it is still technically in the middle of a field. It is in the middle of a sheep field. So if you visit Stonehenge, you might see some sheep. Has anyone been to Stonehenge? Nope. I have not met anyone that's been to Stonehenge yet in my classes. So I met someone a few weeks ago that had been to Hagia Sophia, so that was cool. But he's from Turkey originally, so that kind of makes sense. So during the Neolithic era is when we see the beginning of civilization, specifically with that agricultural revolution, is when we start using that term civilization. Civilization refers to cultures that have complex social orders, governments, hierarchies. So think of like Egypt, and you're on the right track. Egypt has the pharaoh at the top, and then the priests, and then the scribes, and then military people, and then regular people, and then slaves. That's a social order. That's a hierarchy. Think of also places that have developed monetary systems, that have developed job systems. All of those things come about thanks to that agricultural revolution. People don't have to waste time following their food anymore. And now there is a surplus of food thanks to the development of crossbreeding different grains and things like that to make more produce. there's an excess, which means that not everyone has to be doing one thing. People can diversify and develop their own jobs, which is why in Egypt we see an increase in things like scribes, which those are the guys that write things. And you see an increase of like people that are more interested in education. That's because you have to have a certain amount of free time with that, and that comes from being a civilized society. Which that was a really long overview of what a civilization is. Probably more in depth than you needed. But different elements that you might come across in the civilization. They have agriculture where they're growing their own food, animal husbandry, meaning they're raising their own livestock, jobs, specialization, writing, and the production of bronze and other precious metals. And I apologize ahead of time. I've been listening to way too many podcasts about ancient civilizations lately, so you might end up getting a lot more information that you needed to tonight. My other classes did not get that because I was not listening to these podcasts then. So the first civilizations and the ones that we're going to primarily be focusing on tonight are the ones that happened around the Tigris and Euphrates River and the Fertile Crescent in present-day Iraq, which is Mesopotamia, starting off with the Sumerians. Mesopotamia changes hands a lot of times. We'll talk about it a bit in a second. And the other people group we're going to look at tonight are the Egyptians located in the Nile River Valley. The Indus River people in India and the Yellow River people in northern China, you might come across in your individual presentation sections. If your art piece does apply to the Indus River Valley people or the Yellow River Valley people, you might want to talk about that a bit. If it doesn't apply to that, then probably don't talk about that because it won't make any difference. But keep in mind for those individual presentations, I did say that you're allowed to include some history or religion if it helps us put your piece into context. So starting off, we're going to start off in ancient Mesopotamia with the Sumerians. The Sumerians gave us a whole lot of stuff. They gave us the wheel. They gave us the very first form of writing, cuneiform, and they gave us ziggurats, which is the first term that we're going to be talking about in this section today. A ziggurat is a building used for worship. Ziggurats actually inspire the early pyramids, but they're a little different from a pyramid, and we'll talk about why when we get to that section. So Mesopotamia itself is a piece of land in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Because it is in between two rivers and there are no mountains or deserts surrounding it, there's no way to stop invasion or protect yourself. For example, in Egypt, you have a desert. So there's kind of a little bit of a barrier there to help you from invasion. In ancient Greece, there's the Mediterranean. So there's a little bit of a barrier there to help you from being invaded. In Mesopotamia, there's no natural barriers to help prevent you from invasion, which is why Mesopotamia gets conquered a lot. So the Sumerians are the first people group that lived in ancient Mesopotamia. Eventually, it's going to change over to the Babylonians' hands, and then we go to the Assyrians, and the Persians and the Neo-Babylonians, and it changes hands like 4 or 5 times because it keeps getting conquered. So we're going to try and not focus on that part tonight because otherwise you're going to get bogged down with a lot of invasion stories. And instead, we're just going to focus on the fact that, yes, there were multiple civilizations that lived in one spot. They lived there at different time periods, though. Does that make sense? That was really confusing. I tried to do that as simply as possible. Anyone need me to explain that again? You guys got that? Because I think I got lost halfway through. Okay. Well, we're going to start off with the Sumerian ownership. The Sumerians had city-states. If you know anything about ancient Greece, you will know they did as well. So each city-state had its own little hierarchy system and government, but they were all under the umbrella of Sumeria, but they had their own different government in each city-state. Each city-state had a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy in ancient Sumeria were the priests. The priests, they basically ran the government, so there was no separation of religion and state then. And because the priests were at the top, they made all the rules. They benefited the most from this society hierarchy system. The reason why the priests were at the top of the Sumerian hierarchy is because they were the ones that were communing the most with the gods. Ancient Sumerians believed that the gods could come down from heaven and talk to them, but that the gods wanted to still be close to heaven, so they wouldn't come too far down, which is why they had ziggurats. Ziggurats were supposed to be sacred mountains, man-made mountains, that helped link heaven and earth. So the taller your ziggurat was, the more likely a god was to come down and visit it. It's thought that the Tower of Babel in the Bible was probably a ziggurat, for those of you that are religious savvy there. Ziggurats are made with sun-baked bricks, so they're not super sturdy, because sun-baked clay is not super sturdy, which is why we don't have too many ziggurats left. Here is this is actually a reconstruction. This is not what that sucker originally looked like when we found it. You can kind of see that little mound of dirt at the top of it is what it would have originally looked like when it was found. But lovely conservationists went and restored a good chunk of this ziggurat in Ur-Nammu. So this one was built around 2100 BCE, and originally at the top of this staircase, there would have been a temple. Oddly enough, Sumerian temples, the entrance to the temple wasn't directly at the end of this staircase. It would have been on the side, so you would have had to walk around the side to get into it. Well, that's just a random fact, which is kind of weird. And of course, the priests would have lived at the top in the temples. And here we have a lovely little statue of Gudea. Gudea was one ruler in a very brief period of Sumerian history. Gudea was known to have very close communication with the gods, who came down and told him to restore all of their temples. So he spent a whole bunch of money that the Sumerians did not have, rebuilding a whole bunch of temples. But on his skirt here, you can see a cuneiform. I mentioned that the Sumerians invented cuneiform. Cuneiform is the very first system of writing ever, which is kind of cool. And also, part of the Sumerian people is tombs. So the Sumerians would frequently bury their dead in tomb complexes. Of course, the more important you were, the nicer your tomb was. The less money you had, the more likely you would just be buried on top of other people in a little complex. But we're going to look at a small lyre. A lyre is a musical instrument from a king's tomb. And then we will take a little side trip to Acadia. The Akkadians were very brief rulers of Mesopotamia in ancient times. So here is a piece of that lyre. This is actually like the whole thing. So it would have been a wooden instrument. It's similar to a harp. There would have been strings on this. Of course, because it had strings and wood, those pieces no longer exist today because it's really old and wood deteriorates. But it would have looked more like this. Now what we have left is this piece, which shows animals performing human tasks in a set of panels. These are thought to illustrate possibly stories of the tales of Gilgamesh, which are ancient stories that originated from Mesopotamia about the hero Gilgamesh. And of course, here is that 4-section panel. The bull's head's kind of interesting. This is once again like a reproduction, but the head itself was gold gilded and it had a blue beard on it. The blue is a precious stone called lapis lazuli. That's going to come up a few times in this course, that stone. It's a very precious stone, and it would have been considered very expensive and rare at that time to kind of signify his importance as a king. The Akkadians, when they took over, they also buried their dead, and they buried their dead with masks and heads and statues. This is a head of an Akkadian ruler. You can see that his ears have been cut off and his eyes have been gouged out. That's because whenever another people group took over after the Akkadians, they desecrated the graves. But this is a great example of a bronze. This bronze was made using the lost wax casting method. So if you can remember back to that section, you know how this was made. And of course, we have our victory stele of Naram Sin. This is a great example of something called hierarchic scale, which is going to come up a lot in this class tonight. Hierarchic scale is a way of showing importance of figures, i.e., the bigger the guy is in the picture, the more important he is. The smaller the person is in the picture, the less important they are. So here we see hierarchic scale used to show off the importance of Naram Sin, who was a ruler in ancient Mesopotamia, and it is showing off his victory. You see there would have been actually 3 sons at the top. Now there's only 2, and Naram Sin is so large in scale that he is almost the same size as the mountain. And you notice that the people that he is conquering are very small. That's because they are not important. They are the enemies and they have lost. Naram Sin is important. Naram Sin is a ruler, so he's very large. We're going to see hierarchic scale used quite a bit with the Egyptians as well. Speaking of the Egyptians, so ancient Egyptian art remained relatively the same for 2,500 years. If you once again take that art history class, you would learn that ancient Egyptian art is split into 3 time periods. But tonight we're just going to do a little brief preview of some of the main highlights of Egyptian art. The first of which are the Great Pyramids. The Great Pyramids are not the oldest pyramids. The oldest pyramids would have been the flat pyramids, followed by the step pyramids, and then the Great Pyramids were the newer style and the final style. So the Great Pyramids of Giza were built for pharaohs, also known as god kings. If you were a pharaoh, then you were basically born of the gods or selected by the gods to rule. These are large stone blocks. So unlike the sun-baked stones seen in the ziggurats, we have really large pieces of stone that have been carved out. They do not use mortar to hold these stones together. These stones have been shaped to fit into their specific places. The pyramids themselves also have very narrow passageways. There's a few that have like some trick chambers to try and throw off grave robbers. Of course, the Great Pyramids were robbed. There's nothing in them anymore. But here are those Great Pyramids. And of course, they are of the pharaohs Khafre, Khufu, and Menkaure. Menkaure is the smallest. And of course, on the other side of this, you would find the Sphinx, which is part of Khafre's complex. And once again, these would have been built to honor the pharaohs as a final resting place. The Egyptians believed in the afterlife, so a large amount of the works that we see from them exist because of that particular belief, because they were buried with so many objects and artifacts that we still have today. That's how we learn about a lot of these people. Unfortunately, we only get to learn about the really wealthy people usually because they're the only ones that could afford to be buried extravagantly with a bunch of artifacts. So we don't get to learn too much about the regular people. But honestly, I don't know, we do get to see some pretty cool stuff. So we are in Egypt now. Egypt is split into two sections. There is an Upper Egypt and a Lower Egypt. A bunch of you are probably wondering why Upper Egypt is below Lower Egypt. That is because the Nile River flows in an opposite direction. It flows from south to north. Most rivers do not, but the Nile River flows this way from south to north, which is why Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north. And of course, it ends in a lotus shape, which is why a lotus is so important for the ancient Egyptians. But like I said, Egypt was once two separate kingdoms. There was once an Upper Egypt kingdom with their own pharaoh, and a Lower Egypt kingdom with their own pharaoh. Eventually, those two Egypts will end up being united into a one Egypt, which is what most people refer to when we're talking about ancient Egypt. So like I said, the Egyptians believe in an afterlife. They believe that you will need a lot of things to take with you into the afterlife. So basically anything that you might possibly need in the next world, they would bury with you, including pets. They would bury their pets with them. Some would bury their wives with them, or their servants. Well, actually, they usually did bury their servants with them. Here's a fun thing to think about. The servants probably didn't die the same time as their master. So, but the Egyptians were not the only people group to do this. This is actually pretty common in the ancient world. Anyone that does Emperor Qin and his burial site, you might want to check that out because he does something similar for your individual presentation. So because of that, we have very extravagant funerary complexes such as the pyramids, but partway through Egyptian architectural history, the pharaohs, instead of having pyramids, switched to having funerary temples built for them, such as this funerary temple complex built for Queen Hatshepsut, which we see here. This would have been a very extravagant building. It had a garden out front. All of these little temple areas are lined with hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are wall illustrations that tell stories. This lower temple would have been for a god or goddess for Egypt, and then the back one is where Hatshepsut would have been buried. This is considered to be quite an architectural feat because it is basically part of the mountain that it's behind. And of course, Egypt is very well known for its sculpture as well. Fun fact, when a person was buried usually, or when they died, usually they would want to have some sort of sculptural representation of the person for the possibility of their body decaying. Their spirit would then inhabit the sculpture instead in the afterlife. So it gave them like an extra body if they needed it in the afterlife. So almost all of the pharaohs were buried with a sculpture of some sort. But the first sculpture we're going to look at is not one that would have been buried with a king or a queen or pharaoh or important person, but it was actually a form of propaganda, and that is the statue of King Menkaure and his queen. Most Egyptian sculpture does not really change ever. They are very compact, sturdy people in very interesting positions. More often than not, the sculptures of the pharaohs will all look similar. They wanted to be portrayed as strong people. So even if they looked old and weak, they would be portrayed as strong young men because they didn't want their people to think they were weak. When Menkaure took over being pharaoh, he went and put statues of himself everywhere. He's not the first or the last pharaoh to do that, but he thought that putting himself up everywhere kind of reminded everyone who was in charge, and it wasn't a bad idea. It was a good form of propaganda probably for back then. But there was not too much human anatomy put into thought, but more than what we've seen so far tonight. You'll understand what I mean. So it is a very frontal pose. Her hand right here is technically not fully carved out. It's kind of like halfway into his body. You can see that they've given him strong muscles once again to try and portray him as strong. His fists are clenched down to his side. And both of them have 1 foot forward. When you have 1 foot forward, your shoulders cannot remain symmetrical. You can try that on your own time. But when you take a step forward, your shoulders have to move. So, I mean, there's a little bit of human anatomy that's off with Egyptian sculpture, but the Greeks are actually going to steal this idea and run with it for a while. So early Greek sculpture is going to look almost identical to our King Menkaure sculpture right now. And of course, we have the palette of Narmer, which is a fun little add-in. And it also shows hierarchic scale, which once again is kind of it's an important term for us to know tonight. So here we see Narmer. Narmer is the Egyptian king that unites Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is him doing it right there. So I skipped the slide that told us which crown was which, but this is the crown of Upper Egypt. And Narmer is in the process with this palette image on this one side of conquering Lower Egypt and uniting the two. Narmer, of course, is the biggest one in this image because he is the pharaoh, and he is the pharaoh that ends up uniting the two Egypts, so he's really important. Of course, his attendant in the back is really small, and the people that he's standing on top of are very small. Of course, here behind you see a falcon that is to represent Horus, who is an Egyptian god. He is the sun god. And then if you flip the palette over on the opposite side, we see Narmer He is wearing the crown of both Upper and Lower Egypt because he has united the two Egypts and he is marching with his troops. Of course, Narmer is huge in comparison to his soldiers, and his captain is a little bit bigger than the mass troops. And down below that, we see two lions with their heads entwined. And here's the interesting thing about this palette. It is a palette in the sense of a makeup palette. So if you're familiar with ancient Egyptians or images of them played out in cartoons or in any sort of social media context, you'll probably remember they're wearing like black eyeliner. That's because the black helps to repel sun, so it kind of acts as like an early form of sunglasses. So in this center section right here where those lion heads are entwined, there would have been charcoal kept to put on eyes as an eyeliner to create a shield barrier for the eyes from the sun. So it's a very, very early makeup palette. And of course, we can't talk about Egypt and forget the boy king Tutankhamun, probably the most famous pharaoh, only because we have a whole bunch of his artifacts that he was buried with. So most artifacts that important wealthy members in Egyptian society were buried with were stolen very quickly by grave robbers. However, Tutankhamun's tomb was never robbed. And that's because he died before his actual tomb was done being constructed. So he had to be buried in a lesser tomb. And nobody knew. Because he was buried in that lesser tomb, all of his stuff was still there, including his solid gold sarcophagi. So Egyptian mummies would have been buried with several layers of sarcophagus, which are basically like their caskets. And they also would have been buried with a funerary mask. All of Tutankhamun's sarcophagi and his mask have inlaid gold, a lot of precious stones, and precious materials, which is what makes it really amazing and fascinating, and it's why he's really famous. Plus, it doesn't hurt the fact that the stuff went on tour and made a lot of money. But the mask of Tutankhamun's tomb actually has a large amount of naturalism. That is thanks to his father. So Tutankhamun's father is the one person in Egyptian history that decided to change the art. And he made it very natural. He got rid of the very strict poses and went for a more abstract, organic interpretation of people. Right after his father died, he switched it back to the strict part, but you can still see a little after effects and things looking more natural with Tutankhamun. And this is his mask. So like I said, it is gold. And here is one of his layers of sarcophagi. And last but not least in Egypt, yet another example of hierarchic scale can be seen in the wall paintings from the tomb of Nebamum. Nebamum is probably, or was probably a scribe, a high-ranking scribe in ancient Egypt. And his tomb was very highly decorated in wall paintings and hieroglyphs. So in all of these wall paintings and hieroglyphs, it tells different stories, which is pretty characteristic with ancient Egyptian art. Some of the stories would have been guides to be used in the afterlife. Some of them were just daily life stories, such as the one that we're about to look at. But it is a great example of hierarchic scale. So here we see the priest. He is in the process of hunting which is something he probably would do in the afterlife that the Egyptians pictured. Behind him is his wife, who is slightly smaller, and then the smallest human in the figure is his daughter. She is the smallest because, of course, she's the least important. It's interesting to note that all of these people are in profile view and depicted very flatly and in a two-dimensional format, but the animals in the picture are a lot more realistic. So that shows us that the Egyptians could make something look realistic. They just chose not to. Now, speaking of Egypt, a people group that was very heavily influenced by ancient Egyptians are the ancient Greeks, which is who we are going to be talking about next. But first, we're going to take a break. So come back here at 6:55 and we will get started with ancient Greece. And you're going to want to take good notes on ancient Greece. For those of you that don't need a break, feel free to check out the Padlet using the QR code, or I have posted a link in the chat. But you still have 4 minutes of your break too. So you have 1 minute left on your break. Okay, so you should be back already. Before we get into this next section, I thought it might be fun if we talked about what we each thought of when we thought of Greece. So you can either use this QR code or you can use the link that I posted in chat. It'll take you to a Padlet, and the question that it's going to ask you is what comes to mind when you think of Greece. You can write anything you want. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that. I know I always get jealous of people that go to not ancient Greece, but to Greece for vacation because the water looks so nice. It looks super relaxing there.
Apparently, someone was saying that in reality, it's like gross. Like at least the city is like, I mean, the shore.
Because when I went to Venice, they said to make sure not to get into the water because it would give you a rash because it had so much bacteria in it. And it was disgusting. So I'd believe it. I think it just might be pictures. Pictures are deceitful. Someone says they think of islands. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't get to talk about the island cultures in art appreciation. I get to in that art history class, but I don't get to in art appreciation. But the Aegean island people and the people of Crete had some really interesting art that they produced. So once again, if you use that QR code, it will take you to the Padlet, or you can use the link that's in our chat, which will also take you there. Someone said Athens. Yeah, I think of Athens. It's like the main city-state. They end up eventually conquering the other city-states, and it makes them really mad. Because then all of the other city-states have to pay taxes to Athens, and Athens uses that tax money to build the Acropolis. Got some interesting answers.
Sorry, I don't have my phone, so I can't do it.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, my morning classes, when they wrote theirs, they mostly thought of sculpture, I think is what the majority of them wrote. So we're getting some different answers in this class, which is nice to see. Most of us adults are thinking of Greece and thinking of we want to go there on vacation. The morning class, which is mostly high school students, are thinking of mythology and sculptures. So it's kind of interesting to compare the two. Since Brock can't see it, I'll switch to that screen really fast so that you can see.
I think of Greece is the Parthenon and Mediterranean food.
Yeah, oh, the food. I love Mediterranean food. So what I think of is city-states, like a bunch of you guys mentioned Athens. I do the same thing. I think of idealized human figures just because, yeah, I'm big into art history, so that's the only reason. I think of columns. I don't know why, other than, once again, art history. And I think of the Olympics, which there's a funny story behind that. And I told one of my morning classes this story, but only one of them. And they were like, you have to tell everyone this story now. So I guess I will. But once when I was in 5th grade, our teacher decided for history lessons that she was going to divide us into city-states, and in our groups, we were competing with each other. So there was like a group of 5 kids that were Athens, another group of 5 kids that were Corinth, and another group of kids that were Sparta. And we would compete with each other for points. So that's the reason why I think of city-states and the reason why I think of the Olympics as well, because we had our own version of the Olympics in that class. And I gotta say, I was a member of Sparta and we kicked butt and we won. But yeah, So that's why I think of those two things. Idealized human figures in columns, though, come because of art history. But funny enough, the Greeks were not the first people to use columns. And once again, if you take that art history class, you'll figure out which group was actually the first one to use columns and who the Greeks stole it from. Speaking of stealing, though, the Greeks steal a lot of things from a lot of different people. And then the Romans steal from them, which we will see today. So some important key terms before we get too far into this that we will come across are crater. A crater is a large vessel with handles, and I mean huge, like really, really large. And it would have been used to mix wine and water. A lot of times you'll see craters at funeral sites, and they would be used as like grave markers. Craters were also used at parties and festivals because it was a huge vessel that you could mix wine and water with to serve at parties. This is my older crowd, so I do get to talk a little bit more about partying in ancient Greece tonight, which is exciting because that's like half the fun with ancient Greece. Our next key term is kore and koros. Those kind of go together. Those are the archaic male and female figures. The kore is the archaic male figure. She was youthful. And the koros is the archaic male figure who was also youthful. So kore and koros were only used during the archaic period. That is a specific period of time in ancient Greece. And I will explain that timeline in a moment. Brock, by the way, you did good. You got yours right. I read it earlier today. I haven't graded it yet, but I read it and they were all right. And then, of course, our last term is contrapposto, which literally translates to counterpoised, and that will come up when we get into classical Greece. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to write those key terms, and per the usual, if it'll let me, I guess it's not going to let me unless I get out of it. Hang on. Oof, we really got out of it, man. Minor blip. I guess in Google Slides, I can't copy while I'm presenting. I was going to copy it for you guys. I'll go back to present. Sorry. Ugh, it doesn't want to copy and paste. I'll just leave it on this slide for a while for my people writing.
Thank you.
And just a reminder that your discussion post does actually come from this chapter, so you're going to want to pay attention pretty close. And these key terms are actually really important to answering that discussion question. Not so much crater, but the others are. Taylin, Alba, you guys good?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
just checking. Because you're the ones that always tell me whether you're not. So, some common misconceptions with Greek art. The main one is that a lot of people assume that the Greeks just up and started making art all of a sudden. They were making art for a very long period of time prior to what we consider to be Greek art. Once again, if you take that art history class, sorry, I'm really selling that, but we do go into this a lot more in depth in that class. With art history and art appreciation, we just get a really brief overview. So if you are enjoying this second half, you'd probably really like that class because we get to look at stuff a lot more closely and discuss things more. But the Greek art that we're covering today starts in 900 BC. Keep in mind, though, it's not like they woke up January 1st, 900 BCE and decided, okay, guys, we're going to start making art now. They were already making art prior to that. It's just around 900 BCE that we start considering things to be Greek art. And of course, Greek art is split into several different periods, the first of which is the geometric period. The geometric period often gets glossed over because it's primarily just pottery, because it's very, like, it's the early points of civilization in ancient Greece. So the main three periods in ancient Greek art that most art historians consider to be part of that timeline are actually the Archaic period, Classical period, and Hellenistic period. So in your discussion post, when it asks you to name and discuss the three periods in Greek art, you're going to want to look at the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period, which is why, Brock, I said you were correct. But we are going to briefly talk about the geometric period, which, like I said, is primarily just vessels and craters. The geometric period goes from 900 BCE to 700 BCE, roughly. The Archaic period goes from 700 BCE to 480 BCE. Keep in mind, once again, though, it's not like on January 1st, 700 BCE, the Greeks were like, okay, we're not doing geometric period style art anymore, guys. We're only doing Archaic. There is an interchanging and interflowing between these art styles and periods. It's not like they just quit one day and started doing something else. Think of like trends today with, I don't know, iPhones. It's not like because Apple comes out with a newer iPhone that everyone that owns an iPhone goes out and gets that new version. Some of us still have the older versions. Same thing with these periods of art. There's still some people that are doing the older styles, despite the fact that some others have moved on. Of course, the Archaic period, like I said, ends roughly in 480 BCE, and the Classical period roughly begins in 510 BCE. You notice there's a big overlap in years there. There's a reason. It's because things didn't stop and start. Classical period lasts until 320 BCE. Once again, very rough there with those estimates. And the Hellenistic period begins in 323 BCE through 31 BCE. It's through the Hellenistic period that we start seeing a lot of Roman influence. This is around when Rome takes over Greece. And so the Roman art is going to end up influencing Greek art in this period. Hellenistic literally translates to Hellen-like. Hellen means Greek, so it means Greek-like. So it's not true Greek, it's Greek-like. That's because there's a lot of outside influence at this period in time. But even throughout all these other periods, we're going to see influence from other countries. That's because Greece had a very large trade network, so they would interact with other cultures, such as the Egyptians, which you'll see a lot of influence from in the Archaic period. Any questions about this before we move on? Because this is kind of important for you to understand before we can get going. Okay. Here's a little timeline to help you guys out. Like I said, it's not like Greek art just starts with the geometric period. There were actually the dark ages of Greek art with the Minoans and Mycenaean people. as well as the Cycladic and the Aegean people, which, like I said, are the island people groups that we don't get to talk about in this class. Unfortunately, they're really cool. And of course, the geometric period, which has a large amount of pottery and craters. We're going to take a closer look at this one in a moment. The Archaic period has our Kourei and Kouros. And then, of course, the Classical period and the Hellenistic period. It's the Classical period that most people think of when they think of Greek art. And that timeline kind of helps lay out things a little bit better. So we are going to start off tonight with the geometric period. With the geometric period, once again, we see a lot of pottery, specifically terracotta clay pottery. We will see terracotta being used also during the Archaic period. Terracotta is a type of earthenware fire clay, so it's a low fire, meaning that high temperatures were not required. Sorry, I have cat hair on my face, so I keep like... Some key features that pop up in the geometric period. It marks the end of Greece's Dark Age, like I mentioned, the Minoan, Cycladic, Aegean people groups, and the art produced by them during that period are considered the Dark Age. Is it dark? No, it's just the name that they're given. And then, of course, comes the geometric period, which is when people start, that's basically, it's the beginning of the agricultural revolution in ancient Greece is what that marks. It gets the name geometric period because a majority of the pieces created in that time have geometric shapes on the artifacts. So it's not a super clever title, it describes what it looks like. So we'll see a lot of triangles, squares, circles, and things like that. The patterns are extremely repetitive in geometric art, and they're commonly seen on vessels called craters. What is a crater again? Anyone? What's a crater?
Large vessels with handles.
Yes, very good. And I'll come back to this slide in a second, but just to reiterate the geometric shapes, we see the circle, triangle, very rough dimensions and repetitive patterns. And here's that slide again. Anyone still need time on this one? Okay. So here is our first crater. This is the Diplon crater, is what its formal title is, also known as the terracotta crater. Its formal title is Diplon because it was found in the Diplon cemetery in Athens. It was used as a grave marker. Like I mentioned, occasionally craters would be used as grave markers. And you can actually see an illustration of the person who died in the crater. But first off, we can see it's a very large vessel. It doesn't look super large in this picture, but trust me, it is huge, way bigger than it looks here. And of course, you see a repetitive geometric key pattern. That's what that's called. It's called a key. At the very top rim, and of course, geometric shapes and figures to illustrate a story used, as well as black bands. This is called black figure pottery. A lot of earlier Grecian art is done in black figure pottery. All that means is that the figures are in black. They'll switch to red figure partway through. But here we see his funeral on the top band and a little bit about his family on the bottom. So you'll notice there is a man lying horizontally and a whole bunch of people standing vertically. The man lying horizontally is the one that's died. He is laying on his funeral pyre or pier, and the checker patterned thing floating above him is actually the blanket that would have covered him while he was being burned, because they cremated their people back then. And of course, the people standing vertically on each side are the mourners and the family members mourning his death. And then on the lower band, you see a horse, well, horses pulling a chariot and men carrying shields. That tells us one of two things. Number one, possibly that he was in the army, but probably not. Number two, his family had a major military achievement and they're known for it, which is the more likely one. The reason being is the shields that these men are carrying are from a much earlier time period than this crater. So way older than he would have been alive to use. That's a whole lot of information about one pot, and that tells you just how much information we can learn from a people group from the things that they leave behind. Here is a different kind of example from the geometric period. Instead of a piece of pottery, we have a rare example of a bronze figure. Once again, a reminder that we are now in the Bronze Age of history. We still see some influence of geometric patterns, however, not quite as obvious in the sculptural format as in the crater and porcelain images that we just looked at. But this is the bronze man and centaur. This actually tells a very important story in ancient Greek mythology, or at least important to the Greeks. It is the story of the Lapiths fighting the centaurs. The Lapiths are the men, and they represent civilization. The centaurs are the half horse, half man people that are primitive or less than, which is one of the reasons why the man is larger than the horseman, even though horses are technically bigger than people. This is a great example, once again, of hierarchic scale. You're probably tired of hearing me say that. But the man is being shown bigger than the centaur because he is more important. The man also represents civilization. The Greeks consider themselves to be much more civilized than the people that surround them. And of course, we can tell that this particular Lapith or man has beaten the centaur because there's actually a spear stuck into the side of that centaur. And after the geometric period, we move into the archaic period, the first of three that you're going to really want to pay attention for your discussion post today. We're going to start off the archaic period the same way we did the geometric one, by looking at some pottery. This is a terracotta amphora jar. Amphora jars usually used to hold oils or perfumes. They have a nice little lid on them most of the time. Amphora mostly refers to the shape though. And this is another example of black figure pottery. However, we have lost our geometric shapes on here. These shapes are much more reminiscent of the Egyptian wall paintings that we looked at earlier. That's because during the archaic period, the Greeks were very, very influenced by Egyptians. They had increased their trade with Egypt quite a bit, and Greek scholars and historians, which is kind of weird to think about historians in ancient Greece, but they did exist. They would go study in Egypt and bring back information and share it with people, and that in turn affected governments, art styles, literature, and a bunch of other stuff. Some key features of archaic art, like I said, it shows a lot of influence from Egypt. We see our kore and koros in the Archaic period and only in the Archaic period. Those terms are not used after the Archaic period. But once again, a kore is a very youthful female figure and a koros is a youthful male figure. We see figures that are in rigid frontal poses like the Egyptians. They will oftentimes have 1 foot forward. Their shoulders will be completely level, which, like we just discussed, doesn't happen when you take a step forward. The arms are rigid at their side, like the Egyptians.
I don't care, it's not physics teacher, so you have interest in that. That's not here to me.
Can they hear us on the spot?
Yes, Brock didn't. The weight is evenly distributed, just like in ancient Egypt, and it shows men and women, young men and women in their prime. Any guesses by anyone as to what a prime age would be for a youthful figure? Because they're trying to show them in idealized forms. So what do you think that age would be? Someone in their prime. Don't think too much. No one's ever missed it before.
Like,
Huh? Someone said something. I heard it. What do you think your prime age would be for your body when it looks its best?
20s.
20s, yes. Very good. So the kore and koros are youthful figures in their 20s. In fact, a majority of Greek art through the Archaic and the Classical period show young men and women in their 20s because that's when their bodies looked their best. And Greek art is very much centered around showing people in idealized forms. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Classical era because they were even more interested in that than the Archaics. Archaic art, in fact, a good chunk of Greek art would have originally have been painted, specifically sculptures, which we don't normally think about when we think about ancient Greece. Archaic sculptures of people had really funny hair. If you remember the beard of the bull, the blue beard, that's the way these people's hair, their hair looked like, so it was curled. And the Archaic people always have something called the Archaic smile on their statues. The Archaic smile is like what that smiley face looks like. It's a very dumb, goofy looking smile. Oh, did everyone get that? There was a lot on that one. I'll give you a second more to write on that. Because you're going to want this one. So here is our image of our koros, our youthful male. Oh, here's another thing that I forgot to mention. A lot of Greek art is nude. So if that offends you, I am so sorry. I always forget that because I've just become so like oblivious of it at this point. So like I said, if that offends you, I apologize, but we are going to be looking at a lot of it. But here is our archaic young man. You'll notice the pose is almost identical to the Menkore statue of the pharaoh Menkore with his wife. That's because it is identical to what the Egyptians were doing. They literally just copied them and changed the fact that the pharaohs were clothed, and they took the clothes off, and then they changed the head. So instead of having a pharaoh face, they now have really large eyes. Large eyes are typical of the ancient Dark Ages Greek art that we didn't talk about. But all of those Dark Age Greek art people would have really large eyes in their sculptures and paintings. And of course, you also see the braided hair. And if we got a close up, you'd see that he's smiling for absolutely no reason. And here is our kore, our youthful female. This is called the peplos kore. That's because the garment that she's wearing is called a peplos. This was found in the Acropolis in Athens, which tells us that she's probably a goddess. We aren't sure which one, but we've got it narrowed down to 2, and I'll talk about which 2 in a second. Of course, she would have originally been painted. I'll show you what she would have looked like painted in a second as well. And she would have had an arm. There used to be an arm there. The arm broke off. By the way, both of these are done in marble. However, a lot of archaic art is done in terracotta. So they would also do life-size figures like this in terracotta clay, which is impressive. But you also see here the very stiff, rigid frontal pose. One of her hands is clasped very tightly to her side. She has the braids and she has the archaic smile. And here is what she would have looked like with color. So depending on what she was holding in that one hand, it would have told us specifically which goddess she was. They've narrowed it down to either Athena or Artemis. Most people, though, think that it's probably the goddess Artemis because on her peplos, there are images of deer, and Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, i.e. deer. But yeah, that tells you a little bit about her and what she would have looked like. Keep in mind as we move forward that a lot of Greek art was painted. For example, all of the marbles in the Parthenon were painted. It's just the paint didn't last. Although the marbles on the Parthenon didn't survive very much either. We'll talk about that when we get to that. So the archaic period happened with their goofy archaic smiles, and then something really, really big happened. And that big thing is called the classical period. The classical period, like I said, is what most people associate with ancient Greek art. It's what they think of. The main guy that we have to thank for the classical period is Paleolithic. He is the first artist that we have discussed since we started the art history section. And he made the spear bearer, which we see right here. Of course, like it says, this is a Roman copy. Most early classical Greek art would have been done in bronze. If you remember, I think it was like last week or the week before that, I mentioned that when Rome took over Greece, they needed bronze armor and shields and things like that. So they melted down the bronze to use it. But before they destroyed the statues, they made copies of them in marble. And you can always tell a Roman copy from a Greek original based on the goofy little random structures that they put on the sides, because marble weighs more than bronze and this dude would break if it wasn't for those. So Polykleides is the creator of something called contrapposto. Contrapposto translates to counterpoise. All that means is that when you put all of your weight on one leg, that hip rises up and the other one naturally falls. In turn, your shoulders will move as well. So like I said earlier with the Egyptians, when you take one step forward, your shoulders naturally have to turn. But in Egyptian sculpture, they didn't do that. The Greeks finally figured it out, specifically Polyclitus. And that's because Polyclitus did a ton of studies on real people. He studied a lot of different models. In fact, he wrote a whole book about it, in which he wrote down all of his mathematical proportions and studies. And in his book, he wrote down what he felt were the specific perfect mathematical proportions for a youthful male. And the culmination of those mathematical proportions and studies is what we see in the spear bearer. Is that the perfect male? I don't know. But in ancient Greece time, I guess it was. Like I mentioned a while ago, versions of what people consider to be perfect or idealized change throughout history. So what we consider to be attractive today might not, well, probably would not have been attractive way back in ancient Greece. They would have had different standards for beauty. And at this point in history, Polyclitus felt like the spear bearer was the perfect standard for an idealized male and his proportions and what they should have been. And of course, like I said, it is our first example of contrapposto, which basically just means relaxed and not super stiff. He would have actually have been originally holding a bronze spear as well. And here's just a fun little thing. So like I said, archaic period, they were heavily influenced by the Egyptians, and then all of a sudden, bam, contrapposto comes along. So this is just a little fun gag about this ancient Egyptian guy. Said he came back from Greece and he got into contrapposto, which is why he's not stiff and they all are. But like we mentioned when we were going over ancient Greece, or not ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, they probably knew how to do that. They just chose not to. So here is another example of the influence of contrapposto. We now see people performing movements and action in the classical period of Greek art, such as the discus thrower or the discobolus, which once again is another Roman copy. A lot of classical Greek art is also made of Olympic athletes because they were supposed to have been like the epitome of the idealized form. The reason why the Greeks were so interested in portraying people in their most perfect forms is because the Greeks felt that people were the closest things to gods and goddesses. And the gods and goddesses are perfect beings. So why would you not want to show people as perfect beings as well? If that makes sense. When we get to Christian art, they do the exact opposite. So classical art actually happens in 3 stages. Once again, if you take that art history class, we get to go into the 3 stages of classical art. There's an early classical, a high classical, and then a late classical, and Hellenistic is considered the late classical period. During the classical period, though, we see not only a change in sculpture, but we also see a change in architecture. For example, capitals. You don't need to write this slide, though, unless you really want to, for those of you that are riding along. This is mostly just to remind me where I'm at. I'll come back to that Venus of Medici in a second. So here are our capitals. The Doric capital, by the way, a capital is the top of a column. So here we have our column. You'll notice it is fluted. That's what those lines are. They're called fluting. And the very top is called the capital. There are 3 kinds of capitals in ancient Greek architecture, the first of which is the Doric capital. The Doric capital is the very first one. It was created towards the tail end of the Archaic period in the early Classical period. And next to come along was the Ionic column capital, which is very round. This one came about during the High Classical period. And then the last one is the Corinthian column capital. This one is very extravagant and over the top, and it was created during the late Classical or Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period was very extravagant and over the top, so the Corinthian column kind of suits it. You'll notice that the Ionic and Corinthian columns both have bases and the Doric column does not. That is pretty standard. The Romans are going to copy a lot of Greek architecture and add to it. One of the things they do copy are columns. They also copy this right here, which is called a frieze. Oftentimes the frieze will contain little high relief sculptures on them that tell stories. Then now to backtrack to our Venus of the Medici family. So it's called the Medici Venus just because the Medici family owned it at one point. This was done in the High Classical period. So the last few sculptures we've looked at were done in the early Classical period. This one's High Classical. So this one's a little bit, I would say, a little bit more sensual. That being said, it is a depiction of Aphrodite or Venus, who is the goddess of love and beauty. So it makes sense that it's more sensual than the last 2. It's also the only one that we've looked at so far that is a female. Down at her feet, we see a Cupid riding a dolphin. The last time we talked about that was with Emperor Augustus and the Augustus of Prima Porta statue. That's because Aphrodite is the mother of Cupid. And of course, she is trying to be a little bit modest. This is supposed to have been a depiction of Venus as she was getting out of the bath. Now, to spend a little bit of time on the thing that Brock said he thought of first when he thought of ancient Greece, which is the Acropolis and the Parthenon. The Parthenon is this building right here. This is the main temple located in the Acropolis. There are many lesser temples located in the Acropolis. Like I said, this particular temple section was built after Athens conquers the other city-states and starts to tax them. And it would have been primarily used during festivals. So there would be a long procession of people during festival times going through all of these temples to get to the main temple of Athena, in which there would have been a gigantic statue of her housed. Unfortunately, this is all that's left of the Parthenon. That is because when Turkey was invading Greece, a whole bunch of ammunition and gunpowder was stored in the Parthenon and it exploded and it literally blew the roof off the place. So this is all that's left of that. Luckily, well, I don't know if it's really luckily. It's a big argument today. All of the sculptures that were once part of the Parthenon were seized by a man named Lord Elgin, who was a British lord, who said that the Greek people could not take care of their artifacts. Therefore, we need to take them from them before they completely destroy them. And now there's a big argument today that the Greek people want their stuff back, and I can't really blame them. This is what the pediment would, well, one of the pediments, there was one pediment on the east and west side. A pediment is the triangular bit of the temple. Pediments usually illustrate stories. One side of the pediment shows a battle between the gods and the Titans from Greek mythology. This was what it would have originally looked like. This is actually the reproduction of the Parthenon located in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you want to actually see the real, like what it would have looked like then, you have to go to Nashville. Below it, you see a frieze containing metops. The metops illustrate, once again, that story of the Lapiths fighting the centaurs. This is what's left of the pediments, like the actual sculptures that we have left, not the reproductions. So you can kind of see the damage that was done over the years and why Lord Elgin felt it was necessary to seize them. These marble sculptures are now stored in the British Museum in London. So if you want to see the real ones, you have to go to London. If you want to see the reproductions, you can go to Nashville. Here is the other pediment and what's left of it, also located in the British Museum. These are high relief sculptures, by the way. And this particular pediment on the opposite side of this one illustrates the birth of Athena. Athena was born of Zeus's head. So that's how that story goes. And of course, in the center, this is a really bad picture, but there would have been a giant statue of Athena in gold, which the statue no longer exists. And that takes us to our final period in Greek art, the Hellenistic period. Also translates to Greek-like. Hellen means Greek and istic is like, so Greek-like. Once again, we are heavily influenced by other cultures, specifically Roman occupation at this point in time. And the art no longer focuses on realism or idealism. They're more interested in being very exaggerated with their actions and expressive. So with Hellenistic art, we're going to see a lot of movement. Funny enough, we see the same thing happen after the Renaissance period, and I might hint back to that next week when we talk about that. So, like I said, classical Greek art happens in 3 stages. Greek art itself is broken into 3 stages: archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. Hellenistic is the last of one. After this, Greece is completely incorporated into the Roman Empire. So it's during the Hellenistic period that we see the decline of city-states, the decline of Athens being the leader of the city-states, and we also see a large amount of influence from outside cultures. So once again, a lot of exaggeration. We see some hierarchic scale used in this first sculpture we're going to look at, which is the Laocoon group. Laocoon's story is from mythology as well. It's a story of a father saving his 2 sons from being consumed by a sea serpent. However, in the mythological story, Laocoon, the father, is old and the sons are in their 20s. But the way that they have chosen to portray it in the Hellenistic period using hierarchic scale makes the sons that would have been in their 20s look like they're in their teens and they're super buff teenagers. But here is Laocoon and his sons. Once again, Hellenistic art, very expressive, exaggerated, and a lot of movement. The movement is seen throughout thanks to the serpent winding its way around all 3 figures. And of course, the exaggerated poses in all 3 of the figures as well. And of course, because bronze was short in supply during the Hellenistic period, we do see the Greeks starting to make just marble art. And our last example of Hellenistic art, and my favorite, and the one that your book doesn't mention, is the Old Woman. That's literally her name. It's the Old Woman. This shows us a really drastic change. So once again, the Greeks normally were very much focused on showing humans in idealized forms. The Romans, on the other hand, wanted to show things how it actually looked. So here we see a lot of Roman influence. They're showing an old woman as an old woman, which is something the Greeks would have never done. They would have made her look like she was in her 20s if it was actual Greek art. But this is Greek art that's really influenced by Rome. But we do see, once again, exaggerated pose here, which is why this still gets lumped into the Hellenistic period. It is made by a Greek sculptor, so it's still Hellenistic. But this is actually an old woman coming home from a Dionysus festival. Does anyone know who Dionysus is or what he was the god of? His Roman name is Bacchus.
Why?
I like having like a question.
Yeah, so she was coming back from the Dionysus festival. Traditionally in Greece, that lasts about a week. So it's basically a week of drinking because he is the god of wine. That is all you do. So she is coming back from that. And of course, she is drunk. That is why she is disheveled and her dress is falling off of her. She would have originally had arms as well. It's also probably why she's hunched over a little bit because she's probably a little wobbly at this point. So I think that one's funny because it's super realistic to me. And of course, the last thing we're going to cover tonight is Rome. With Rome, we don't see too much sculpture, but we do see a lot of architecture. They created a lot of important architectural features, which we kind of talked about last week with architecture. But like I just mentioned, Romans are very practical with their art forms. They don't care about idealizing human forms like the Greeks did. They like to show people how they actually looked, which we can definitely see in the portrait head of an old man that we're going to look at in a second. This old man would have most likely have been a senator in Rome. We can see a lot of individuality in this sculpture bust. You see his wrinkles, his crow's feet, his age, his worry lines. But like I said, with Roman art, we're mostly going to be looking at architecture and civil engineering because they create the arch, they create the dome, they create aqueducts, they use roads, indoor plumbing. So a lot of great architecture comes from Rome. But here's our portrait head of an old man. So you can definitely see how that old woman from the Hellenistic period in ancient Greece was probably really influenced by Roman art at that time because they're very similar, other than the old woman was not an important figure at all. It was just a random old woman, and this is a portrait bust of a Roman senator, so an important figure. And there's actually a ton of these portrait busts of senators. If you go to any like historical museums that focus on world cultures, once again, like the British Museum, you'll find a lot of these. So some of the public works projects that Rome is known for are the Colosseum as well as the Pantheon, which please don't confuse it with Parthenon. I know they sound very much the same and they actually have the same function. So yeah, it's going to be hard to keep those straight. But we're going to look at the Colosseum first. So this is known as a Flavian amphitheater. Flavian is just a word for a theater person. Because the Colosseum was frequently used for plays. It was also used for poetry, music festivals. But the thing that it's most well known for is, of course, gladiatorial fights. Gladiator fights, sorry. And fun fact, they even had a naval battle in the Colosseum before. They filled it with water, and yeah. There were a lot of animal baitings and hunts that were held in the Colosseum, and of course Christians were also crucified at the Colosseum. So a lot of history. Most of the Colosseum's events were made to entertain the masses. That being said, it had to be quite large. So the Colosseum itself is actually about the size of 2 football fields today, and it held 50,000 people, a lot of people, a whole lot of people. It is several stories of seating, and of course it is a series of Roman arches. And there's actually a basement below too. So there's more below, which is where the gladiators would have been held as well as the animals, and that's how they got the water pumped in for the naval battle and all that. And like I mentioned, the other public's work project is the Pantheon. Like the Parthenon, the Pantheon is also a temple. However, the Parthenon was only a temple for Athena. The Pantheon is a temple for all major gods and goddesses in Roman mythology. The Pantheon has columns on the front as well as a pediment, but instead of it being a rectangular building, it actually has a dome and a circular rear. So the columns and the pediment act as a porch or a portico on the front. And it also has coffers on the inside and an oculus, and I'll point out what that is, and I'll probably come back to this as we talk about it. But here is our columns and our pediment that they stole from Greek architecture. Originally, this would have been a building which you walked up to. There would have been stairs leading up to it. However, because of ages and ages of repaving roads, now, instead of being raised above the ground, the Pantheon is actually slightly below ground. And of course, you can see instead of it being square on the back like the Parthenon was, there is actually a round structure attached. So this front part is the porch or portico. And of course, we see the dome peeking out from behind. So the Pantheon is actually a sphere on the back side of it, a perfect sphere. That being said, it is made using concrete, and they couldn't quite figure out how to completely close off the dome at the top just using concrete, making it a perfect circle on the inside. They did relieve some of the weight on that dome by making recessed squares in the ceiling, which is what those coffers are. Go back really fast for my people writing. Coffers are recessed squares. So they lightened the concrete dome by adding in those recessed coffers into the ceiling. And that hole at the top is an oculus. A lot of people, when I teach this class, think that the oculus has like glass over top of it. There wasn't glass yet, and actually they never did put glass over it. So it's literally an open air hole. So if you ever go to the Pantheon, there's probably going to be pigeons inside because it's an open air hole. It's a great nesting spot. They do keep it pretty cleaned out though. So once again, there's the coffers and the oculus. And of course, there would have originally been statues of the Roman gods and goddesses. However, they were later replaced by Christian figures from the Bible. And the Pantheon is actually home to the burial sites of a lot of famous people, such as the artist Raphael, who we're going to talk about next week in the Renaissance. And the last thing we're going to talk about today, I'm pretty sure it's the last thing, is one of our few examples of ancient paintings, which are from Pompeii. So Pompeii was an island that is part of Rome. Does anyone know what happened to Pompeii?
I don't remember, was it an earthquake or was it a volcano?
Very good. It was a volcano. Yeah, so Mount Vesuvius, which is a volcano on the island, ended up erupting and completely destroying the town of Pompeii. Actually, it didn't really destroy it, actually perfectly preserved the town of Pompeii, but it did kill all of the people in Pompeii. If you ever search up Pompeii, there's actually like several museums dedicated to just the perfectly preserved corpses. So if you're interested in that, it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little morbid, but kind of cool because they were preserved in the exact way in which they died. So you see people that are like hugging their children. You also see people making love to each other as they were about to die, which is weird, but whatever. So there are a few museums in Rome dedicated to that, but other things that came from Pompeii is we have perfectly preserved buildings and architecture and paintings. Most of the ancient paintings were destroyed over time because of being exposed to air and not being taken care of. But Pompeii, because it was buried under volcanic ash, was perfectly preserved until archaeologists discovered it. That being said, we have these lovely paintings. A lot of Pompeii's homes would have been covered in wall murals such as this. These are frescoes. And a majority of the frescoes depict scenes from mythology and scenes from daily life. Don't look up paintings from Pompeii. It's really hard to find PG ones. So yeah. The Pompeii people are very much interested in Dionysus. So a lot of drinking and a lot of inappropriate things happened. And what's funny is that it was displayed in homes, in people's houses. Very inappropriate things, or at least inappropriate is what we would be considering today. Maybe we're just too modest today. But yeah, so that's where we're, oh, fun fact, the red in the background is now known as Pompeii red because almost all of the Pompeii paintings use Pompeii red. But yeah, that's it for ancient Rome. I know it seemed like a lot tonight. It was a lot tonight. We went all the way from, what was it, 75,000 BCE to Pompeii and ancient Rome. And next week we'll start off in the Renaissance. So we will have made it to the 1400s CE era. So quite a large period of time. We've covered a lot of ancient people groups tonight. Hopefully you weren't too overwhelmed, and maybe you were a little bit entertained, and maybe you came away with some fun facts that you can share with others. At least I hope so. That being said, I am going to stick around for a little while to help people that want my help for individual presentations. Keep in mind that you are going to want to do your discussion post for this week, which focuses on ancient Greek art and those three periods of ancient Greek art, the archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. Don't procrastinate on doing that, because if you wait too long, you're going to forget everything. But if you do forget, this recording will be on YouTube. So remember to check it out or use your book. One or the other. But yeah, until then, I will see you guys next week. If you want help, stick around because I'm going to stay on for a while.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Miss.
Bye, guys.
Have a good night.